This video contains spoilers for the whole of Hades 2, including the post-credits quests and multiple of the late-game side stories. When Hades 2 came out, I immediately wrote 1500 words about why its ending didn't work. And then I sat down and wrote 4500 more words about it before Supergiant said, yeah, we agree, and released a major post-early access patch giving quote-unquote enhancements to the true ending. I had to take a little time off to process throwing away my original script, but I eventually went and investigated what this patch actually changed, and luckily, or unluckily depending how you look at it, it's very little. Although it sort of gives Melinoë more agency, that wasn't really ever the problem that I had with it. In fact, Hades 2's core problem doesn't come from her at all, or from Kronos, or even from Hades. It comes from two people, Sisyphus and Persephone. Part 1. Sisyphus. Where is Sisyphus in Hades 2? I'm not saying the game is disappointing because it doesn't include all of the fan-favourite characters of the original, but because Sisyphus was a metaphor. When you're playing a roguelite, it's a Sisyphean task in the classical sense. Your boulder always rolls down the hill. In the original Hades Early Access, the metaphor was even more apt. It was literally impossible for Zagreus to beat Hades, find his mother, and gain his freedom. But unlike Sisyphus, he did make progress. With every run, he would collect darkness to get stronger, or get to know somebody better, or simply gain knowledge of how to beat a particularly tricky enemy. It was basically that one tweet about Sisyphus getting swole, completely turning around what the Sisyphus of the myth actually represented. And that was the core of Hades 1. Although Zagreus was quite literally trapped in hell, everything that he did made it a little bit better. He came up against some of the most classic injustices in mythology and corrected them, reuniting Orpheus and Eurydice, and Achilles and Patroclus, and freeing Sisyphus himself. This worked so well, not just because of the power fantasy of getting to help these people we sympathize with, but because of how it drew out and expanded on the themes of the main plot. Zagreus was trying to escape his abusive father, but his abusive father was also king of the underworld, and had turned his abuses on plenty of other people. By contrast, Zagreus wasn't only concerned with helping himself, he was going to bring up everybody else with him. Before you release Sisyphus from his punishment, he's actually pretty chill about the whole thing. I could be Prometheus, spending an eternity having my liver gobbled up, he says. But even so, Zagreus refuses to accept the clear injustice in front of him. He's guided by his sense of what is right and what is wrong, and what is right is freedom and leisure and connection, and what is wrong is overbearing kings, whether or not they happen to be your father. And so, even though Hades is a roguelite, and Sisyphus kind of needs to stay in place even after you free him so that you can keep talking to him and getting your little health pickups, it doesn't feel meaningless. You have done something for Sisyphus, giving him the chance to take a break and no longer be constantly tormented by the Furies, and he's chosen to stay because he genuinely enjoys where he is. And he loves Baldi! Even though it's clearly a contrivance, it works because it fits the story that's been set up both with Sisyphus and with the game overall, a story about changing things for the better. And so, where is Sisyphus in Hades 2? Why did he leave Baldi behind? And more importantly, on a thematic level, what does it mean that Hades is in his chamber instead? Part 2. Hades. It feels almost poetic. The rogue king who tortured Sisyphus for an eternity, now trapped at the bottom of the same hill, chained to the same boulder, now growing moss. Except, it's not framed as justice. It's not even framed as a question. Is this fair? Do we find punishing Hades in this way satisfying? It's framed, unequivocally, as a bad thing. Melinoë is here to save her father and restore him to his rightful throne. But why the hell am I supposed to assume that it's rightful? This is the question that plagued me through 15 months of Hades 2's early access. I kept telling people that the game was either doing something extremely clever or falling into a trap that it mostly got away with in Hades 1. Because the thing is, even though all of those side stories ultimately saved the tone of the game to me, it was incredibly forgiving of Hades in the end, and it left a lot of threads open to do that, including why Persephone left in the first place. And so, Hades 2 could either address that and have Melinoë struggle with the fact that the family she's trying to regain was complicated and flawed, or it could entirely collapse under the same issue that the first game managed to just about avoid with its better writing elsewhere. Hades will talk to Melinoë about where he currently is. He'll tell her that Sisyphus forgave him in the end. Hades 2 is about forgiveness. It doesn't earn it. Part 3. Echo. Hades 2, like its predecessor, is packed full of characters who have clearly been wronged by the gods. These are sympathetic figures you might know about from thousands of years of history, but even if not, the way they talk in the game about what's been done to them immediately puts you on their side. And if you've played Hades 1, you're primed for what's surely about to happen. You can help these people. You may not be able to stop Kronos, literally, if you're playing in early access and the ending hasn't dropped yet, but like Zagreus before you can still improve the world around you, right? No, you can't. Let's compare Echo to Eurydice in Hades 1. They're both trapped alone in a bad part of hell, and you can reunite them both with their lovers, Narcissus and Orpheus respectively. But we immediately run into a problem here, don't we? Orpheus crawled into the underworld to save Eurydice and almost made it. Narcissus was cursed with self-centeredness. In the games, Orpheus is a close friend of Zagreus, another member of the House of Hades who's able to share his story and his regrets and his hopes. Narcissus sits staring at himself and will never care about Melinoe enough to remember her name. And maybe most crucially, Orpheus loved Eurydice. Narcissus did not love Echo. But still, seeing Narcissus again seems to help Echo get over him. I can understand how that might be possible, although I can't actually tell you how it plays out because it happens entirely off screen, another problem that Hades 2 seems to struggle with in a lot of cases. But it is imaginable. I don't begrudge people who want closure. The thing is, Narcissus wasn't really Echo's big problem, was he? Echo's problem is that she was cursed by Hera to only be able to repeat back what others say to her. But when Melinoe briefly manages to give her voice back, she refuses to take it any further. She says she can help others by reflecting back their feelings and thoughts, and she doesn't want to give that up. Like Sisyphus, Echo refuses to shake things up too much, presumably for logistical reasons. I'm sure recording more voice lines for her would have been a big ask. But unlike Sisyphus, it's not satisfying at all. Echo doesn't have any real reason to want to stay essentially mute. It's hardly a requirement for being a good listener, and she has even less reason to want to stay in a place called the Fields of Mourning, given she's supposedly not mourning anymore. Worse, because she reflects what Melinoe says to her in her quote-unquote confirmation of being alright with the status quo, it just makes it feel like Melinoe is the one forcing this on her. When she says, "Are you alright to remain here?" Echo replies, "Alright to remain here." Except that Melinoe could just as easily have said, "Don't you want to leave?" and Echo would have said, "Want to leave." Even though it's just a fun little writing trick, it leaves Melinoe feeling close-minded and literally unable to be argued with. And the thing is, Melinoe is close-minded. At no point does she look at the root cause of all this, Hera, who cursed Echo for covering for Zeus. It's entirely unfair, and while we might otherwise be able to see this as a story of acceptance, it's impossible because we're getting it directly via Melinoe, who's completely unable to actually see what it is that Echo would need to accept, that she was deeply wronged by an untouchable class of rulers. Part 4. Arachne. There are characters who do know this in Hades 2, and perhaps none more so than Arachne. She lashes out at not only Athena, who turned her into a spider for being prideful of her weaving ability, but at all the gods who have done nothing to help her. Melinoe sets up a meeting between Arachne and Athena, but Arachne refuses to apologize. And why should she? The punishment is arbitrary and cruel. I'm gonna be brave and say it, I don't think that anyone should have the power to turn somebody into a bug, no matter how braggadocious they are. But Melinoe disagrees. She castigates Arachne for blowing her shot, and then does nothing else to help her. Even though it was Hecate's magic that was used to actually turn her into a spider, Melinoe can't whip up her own incantation to reverse it. I know Zagreus would have learned magic for this if he was here. And while all this is happening, Melinoe never wavers on Athena herself or the rest of the gods. Arachne insinuates that the war against Kronos is a mirror of her story, the gods being punished for the consequences of their own pride. But they're not, because Melinoe saves the day. Part 5. Prometheus was right about everything. I'm gonna say something else brave. I think monarchies are bad. This is a pretty common opinion, although I have to say, not as common as I thought it would be when I wrote that sentence without looking it up first. But still, if you point out that this makes a lot of fiction a lot less hopeful than it thinks it is, people get very upset. I know, because I've written about it at least twice. And also because people keep saying One Piece is a flawless piece of media about liberation, but that's a whole other video. And look, I'm not claiming that any piece of media with kings is automatically unwoke and will be banned under the glorious socialist republic, but when your plot hinges on establishing or re-establishing or starting or trusting a system that puts a small group of people above everybody else, you are immediately saying something. And maybe you can pull it off, sometime, somewhere. I don't know, I've never seen it. But Hades 2, where the gods are repeatedly shown to be terrible leaders, does Arachne deserve to live under them? Does Echo? Hey, remember what Sisyphus said about Prometheus? It's fucked up what they did to him, right? For the crime of providing fire to us, to humans. Kind of an inherently sympathetic character, right? It would be weird if they put him in this game saying things that are just inherently true and correct, and then made him one of the main villains.
You who condemn me as a criminal, would you know why I liberated fire from this mountain for the sake of mortal kind?
My own increasingly strong sense of foresight indicates you're going to tell me no matter what.
When I gave mortals nourishment, the meat they would have sacrificed to you, they needed fire then, and more. But you hoarded all of it. So I saved them, and I'll do it again.
An eagle ate that man's liver every day for eternity, and we're putting the guys who did it back in power? And look, I can see you in the comments right now talking about the epilogue and how Prometheus got what he wanted in the end. Did he? There are a couple of lines about how the gods decided to rule benevolently after all this, but we never see what that actually means, or have any idea why they would do that. And then, after some unspecified amount of time, the Fates put down their scissors and the Age of Mortals began. Great. What does that do to improve the lot of Arachne and Echo? Does it stop Prometheus getting gutted by Malinois every night? But maybe I'm overthinking this. Malinois's quest is about family, not power. She doesn't really care about the monarchy, she just wants to be reunited with her parents and her brother. Right? Part 6. Persephone. Malinois's quest revolves around her father. It was him who was front and center in the reveal marketing, it's him who she meets on the way and gets to talk to and get help from, and you know, it's him who the game is named after. But where Hades 1 managed to tie together its themes of family and political rebellion, Hades 2 falls apart by conflating them. Zagreus struggled against his father both personally and socially. Malinois wants him back in the same ways. And we've already talked about the problems that causes in the plot and its expression of theme and its treatment of characters who ought to be sympathetic. But it also makes Malinois and the rest of the game completely sideline a character who was already woefully underexplored in Hades 1, her mother, Persephone. Persephone isn't in most of Hades 1 because she's the thing Zagreus wants to reach. I don't know why Persephone isn't in most of Hades 2. You run into Hades over and over again, and in the final act you get to work together with Zagreus, but Persephone has no role. And while the updated ending at least gave her memories back so that she wasn't dealing with missing raising both her children, something she didn't seem particularly bothered by in the original version anyway, it doesn't make her an actual character with stakes in the story. You could remove her and the game would be functionally identical. Though she shows up when you see Hades in the post-game, she's an accessory to him. She has very little to say and no mechanical function. She doesn't even get a codex entry. You can't give her gifts and she can't give them to you. And here's the thing, Hades 1 was already a huge misstep when it came to Persephone, and I do want to get to that, but first I have to get into the gender of it all. When Hades 2 first came out in early access, I commented to a friend that it was another example of women being the sequel to men, although it was a sideways step from brother to sister where the classic is usually a father to a daughter. But I wasn't expecting that to feel so limiting. I understand Supergiant wanting to give Malinois a sisterhood in keeping with the witchy theme of it all, but where Zagreus feels like a general hero of the underworld, a god if you will, Malinois feels only like a daughter, a sister, a niece or whatever. Again, this comes down to her loyalties. Zagreus works so hard against his family while Malinois never thinks to disagree with them. Her sisterhood is confined to being a literal one, not a metaphorical one. And look, I'm gonna say it because it's incredibly annoying. While Supergiant took on some criticism in Hades 1 about the character designs, there are a couple of fat people now, a lot of it feels a lot worse. Nemesis's tiny waist and both her and Malinois's impossibly short skirts are just distracting. Whatever happened to Aphrodite's face should be studied, and if you get me started on what they did to Chaos, I will scream. But like I said, this problem really started with Persephone in Hades 1. Or, that's a little unfair. It started with Persephone in the modern Greek mythology retelling industrial complex. In her video, The Problem with Greek Mythology Retellings, Kate Alexandra summarizes the myth of Persephone, or as she puts it, the myth of Demeter. The story of Persephone's abduction to the underworld is really about her mother's reaction to it. By withholding the harvest using her power as an agricultural goddess, she starves humans and gods alike, and eventually gets her daughter back, at least for some of the year. Stories that give Persephone agency in going to the underworld and marrying Hades automatically throw out the original meaning of the myth. And there are dozens of these. Hades the game is really only a drop in the bucket here, but it does mean that both games have a fundamental change that ripples out into the rest of the narrative. Of course, all the stuff I talked about with getting to fix everyone's problems in Hades 1 was also a complete reversal of the mythology that Supergiant was pulling from. But as Alexandra also says, retellings cannot be entirely faithful to their source material. Authors must make necessary changes in creating adaptations for our current audience. The beauty of Greek myth is that they're flexible and varied enough to mold to contemporary taste and speak to different times. Perhaps the best retellings emerge when authors don't feel constrained to merely retread well-known myths, but allow themselves the flexibility of amending, reimagining, and reshaping mythology to meet new ends. And having a game come out in 2020 where the theme is, you can't change the fact that the world is unjust, but you can improve it by fighting tooth and nail for those around you, is a fundamentally different affect from having a game come out in 2025 where the theme is, restore the rulers who were petty and vindictive to everyone they came across, and they'll magically stop doing that. And that's why Persephone being a goal rather than a character in the first game almost works. As I said, the ending of Hades 1 has its issues, but it was scaffolded by so much that it managed to hold up. But on the other side of the coin, Persephone being virtually non-existent in Hades 2, even after being saved by Melinoë, only serves to highlight what the game is actually doing with its myths. Part 7. The sequel problem. I know that's not a character, but we're still talking about Persephone, okay? It's just that I needed to break it up a bit. So, before we get into the more structural problems with Hades 2, I want to mention something that I think probably contributed to its issues, but which is very difficult to talk about because it's not some societal force or cultural phenomenon. It's just that making games is very hard. Writing is very hard. Sometimes you need more time than you have, or you're spinning too many plates at once, or you're just having a bad spell and things don't quite work out. I know, I've been there. I do have an ulterior motive for saying this because I think that basically most projects should hire an editor for this exact reason, and that's one of the things I do professionally, but still, it's worth bearing in mind, I think. However, there are bigger things at play here, and the first one is that Hades 2 is a sequel. It's possible to do sequels well. Interrogating the themes of an earlier work through a new lens can create some incredible pieces that both stand on their own and complement their forerunners. But if you think about the average sequel that you've seen recently, it more than likely doesn't do that, right? We're in an era where familiarity shapes so much of what is being made, and that leads to this kind of recursive storytelling where we're constantly looking backwards. The main form of interaction in some of these sequels is Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen at guys we recognize, and that leads to them becoming flanderizations of themselves. I'm going to use Ace Attorney as an example for this because 1, of course I am, and 2, we're in the middle of talking about this on my podcast Turnabout Breakdown, so it's front of mind. And also I get to do a plug. But if you look at the characterization of most of the people in Ace Attorney Investigations 1, they're caricaturishly simple compared to their original trilogy concepts. Edward's main character trait in that game is liking the Steel Samurai. And then Investigations 2 comes around and he's really digging into his character development from the trilogy. It's astonishing how different they feel and how much Investigations 2 feels like a good sequel, while Investigations 1 is a funny little meaningless spin-off. But Hades 2 struggles with this twice over. It is a sequel, and it's also a retelling. It has 2 ways in which it can be pointing, and it hits both of them. Take Dionysus. In Hades 1, he, like everybody else, is clearly an archetypal figure based on how his myths have been passed down to us, but he also has a fairly established place in the narrative, like when he plays with Orpheus to create the fact that one of the original Greek stories conflates him and Zagreus. It's an intentional interaction with the millennia-old stories that Supergiant is pulling from. In Hades 2, we don't get that. Dionysus is at a party the whole time. That's it. Supergiant have never made a sequel before, and yet given how Hades 1 massively outsold their expectations, I completely sympathise with wanting another bite at the apple, and I do mean that thematically and characterologically as well as monetarily. And Hades 2 isn't the worst at this by any means, but it does suffer for it. Like, you know, here are these guys from mythology. It's Arachne the spider. It's Narcissus, the pond guy. It's Echo, she can't talk. We don't do anything with these characters. They don't build to an investigation of either the first game's themes or mythology broadly. We just look at them. Part 8. Cozy Fantasy and Conservatism. Okay, yeah, I lied. We're not talking about characters anymore. Welcome to the politics zone. When I first wrote about why Hades 2's ending didn't work for me, I got a very long Blue Sky response that summed itself up by saying, that's literally what Hades is, it's a cozy game. This is not the only person calling at least one of the Hades games cozy, so let's crack open a can of worms. The idea of cozy or wholesome games has been around for a long time. A lot of games, especially in the AAA space, are entirely structured around violence, and so it's inevitable there would be a counter-movement to that. But it really took off with the creation of the Wholesome Games Twitter in 2019, and then with the first Wholesome Direct, an alternative E3 stream that happened in May 2020. And, you know, yeah, there were a few things going on at that time that made people more likely to want to seek out some kind of escapist fantasy. But the idea of wholesomeness isn't exactly without its complications. Although the capital W, capital G Wholesome Games movement definitely considers itself an inclusive space, positive representation of marginalized groups is one of their criteria, the term itself has been used to exclude undesirables for at least 150 years. In his paper, The Politics of Wholesome Games, Conservative Comforts and Radical Softness, Rainforest Scully Blaker uses the example of Henry Ford promoting square dancing in an attempt to suppress the spread of jazz, since the former, associated with whiteness, was, quote, more intrinsically wholesome. And before you say I'm conflating the terms wholesome and cozy, firstly, this is something that even scholars do. In Agata Vaskovich and Martina Bakan's Towards the Aesthetics of Cozy Games, they use wholesome as one element underneath the umbrella term of cozy. And secondly, I defy you to make any coherent categorization of either, let alone one in relation to the other, but we'll come back to definitions later. As Scully Blaker puts it seems like the founders of this community genuinely want to share these games with a wider audience in the name of broadening who and what are given space in game culture. But the nostalgic gloss of wholesomeness existed well before Ford and persists to this day. Good faith is not enough to avoid perpetuating the same oppressive logics that compel people to seek softer experiences, let alone to meaningfully change these logics. One's actions must be backed up by clear intentions. He goes on to point out that, while the Wholesome Games team say that violence against an oppressor can be wholesome, in reality these games don't seem to make it to their social media or showcases. Or in other words, while the popularity of the label may have been influenced by the pandemic, it doesn't seem to have been touched by the huge protests against racist violence that occurred in the same year. That's because the point of wholesome or cozy games is to instill comfort. And while Scully Blaker argues this can temporarily be a good way of resting and being ready to face the world again, it has to be moderated. As he says, if one is well and truly comfortable, then why would they seek alternatives to the status quo? In this sense, comfort is a conservative affect. It's an enemy of change. So, there is an inherent conservatism to the cozy games movement, and it's worth saying this isn't a games-only problem. Cozy fantasy is also a big marketing term in literature to a similar effect. But we'd better get back to Hades 2 and a pretty big question. What makes it cozy? In one of the articles describing Hades as a cozy game, the author says, if you feel cozy playing it, it's a cozy game, simple as. And that vibes-based approach is basically in effect all the way down. The Wholesome Direct creators say it's subjective and we don't want to pretend that it isn't. But they do have some categories that they suggest contribute, so let's go through them one by one. Wholesome games are less violent when they can be. Milinoe is a trained fighter and wants to murder people constantly. Wholesome games are less stressful when they can be. Milinoe, again, is desperate to murder people and the game is often very fast-paced and frenetic. Wholesome games have lower stakes when they can. It's literally about saving your entire family and deciding who gets to be God. Wholesome games are uplifting when they can be. This one's a bit subjective, but as I've argued earlier, I didn't find it uplifting at all. Wholesome games have positive representation of marginalized groups when they can. Queerness is very naturalized, both in Hades and Hades 2, and they've put more effort into including disabled and fat characters in Hades 2, but there's still the misogyny issues we talked about earlier. I think this is the closest we've come to being successful so far. Wholesome games are cute and comforting when they can be. Maybe there are the bath scenes, there are funny jokes and goofy characters, but mostly you are tearing around killing people. The Wholesome Game team adds that we usually look for games to have at least 2 of these qualities and not the complete opposite of any of them. I think you could get to 2 with Hades, depending on how you categorize, but I also think it does have the complete opposite on both the violence and the stress questions. Just for fun, let's run it past another definition, this time the scholarly one by Vaskovich and Bakun. Cozy games explore themes of safety, abundance, and softness. It's definitely not that. And yet, I do feel, somehow, Hades and Hades 2 are cozy. And that's weird, right? Well, it comes down to two things: Sisyphus and Persephone. By removing Sisyphus and having Hades comment that he was forgiven, Hades 2 sets a tone. It's one where, as long as you don't look too closely, everything is going to work out okay. There will be no upheaval to account for the injustices done to Arachne and Echo. That would be too disruptive. And so too would fully engaging with the myth of Persephone. Instead, she's just here for familiarity. You don't need to actually get to speak with her outside of the influence of her husband. She's just there to be pointed at, to make you feel cozy by being recognizable without addressing anything about her that might be challenging. Hades 2's wholesome vibe isn't because of any of the carefully considered categories that people tried to come up with to capture vibes. It's because of the conservatism. Malinois, like Henry Ford, harkens back to an imagined past where things were good for people who were exactly like her, and ignores what that means for the people the past was terrible for. It's that people are picking up on and assigning the cozy label to. It's ironic that Echo and Narcissus are two of the key side characters in Hades 2. It's a game that's constantly looking at the remains of its past self and catching only parts of it. It's a game that believes in the idea of the glory days, both for the monarchy within its story and the whirlwind success that was Hades 1. But as Scully Blaker says, for whom were the good old days actually good? And who is at risk in our present and in our future?